Friends, I welcome you to my channel. Before listening to this story, I will ask you to like and subscribe. It is not difficult for you, but it is pleasant for me. And we're starting. I rang the doorbell and stepped back to wait for the owner. I hugged my dear Heather and pulled her to me for a quick kiss. Oh, how I loved that woman. She gave me the happiest 4 years of my life. We were going to celebrate our free evening again with my best friend Doug Beavers. This time, we were at his New Year's Eve party at his mansion. I was looking forward to meeting Doug, but even more I wanted to spend the evening and night with my wife in style in the new year. I was about to ring the bell again when Doug finally opened the door for us. He grinned and invited us in very loudly. I already knew from the number of cars parked on the street and in his yard that it was going to be a very big party, but I was still shocked by the number of people crowding inside his house. Doug reached out to Heather and hugged her tightly, then kissed her gently on the cheek before dragging her into the house. He turned away from her and shook my hand before stepping aside again so I could enter. The maid took our coats and disappeared with them. Doug walked between us and said, "God, I'm glad to see you two." I really hate it when my parties get so big, but it seems like I have to invite everyone. I either run a business or I have social obligations to everyone on my list, except for a few good friends like you two. Clarissa is somewhere nearby, probably dodging the hands of libertines as usual. During the evening, Heather and I danced, ate and drank a lot more than we should have. We didn't worry because we knew we had a bed upstairs when we needed it. We were one of the few couples invited to spend the night, so we didn't have to drive drunk, hail a taxi, or force one of us to stay sober as the designated driver. I'm moderately successful in the investment business. Oh my gosh, I'm one of the best. Selling brokers in my office and in the first quarter of brokers in the entire company. So I knew or guessed about a lot of people in this room. My Heather was a very beautiful woman, and she had to fend off advances just like his Clarissa. During the evening, I took the opportunity to chat. I greeted the current customers and reached out to some of the wealthiest people in the room, trying to attract new customers. I also kept an eye on Heather throughout the evening. I trusted her completely, but I have to admit that I was still a little jealous. I was constantly looking out for her and from time to time took the liberty of saving her from a man who, it seemed to me, was trying to be more than just a charming conversationalist. Every time I had to save her at previous parties, I got a smile and a gentle kiss from Heather, usually with a quiet "thank you" or "thank you for saving me, honey" from her. This evening was no exception. Many times I approached when I saw that she was trying to break away from the man who was going to take her away. I received her gentle touch and smile before hugging or kissing on the cheek, followed by her quiet "thank you." We talked for a while, or maybe had a quick dance or a drink and would have gone our separate ways again. As the evening drew to a close, many people left, leaving only those who intended to celebrate the new year with our host. I began to notice that one particular man was following Heather and almost stalking her. He never strayed far from her and was constantly watching her. I recognized his look. He was hooked on her, completely infatuated with her, and took every opportunity to get his way. At first, Heather ignored him or even left. As the evening drew to a close, she began to stay with him longer, even smiling or laughing when he spoke. Sometimes she would gently touch his forearm. It wasn't like my Heather. She had never flirted for so long with any of the men who approached her, especially a stranger. Doug saw me watching them shortly before midnight and came over to me. He said, "This is Jonathan Douglas with Heather. He's a real ass and a real ladies' man. I didn't even invite him, but one of the ladies I invited brought him as her date. I haven't seen them together since you and Heather arrived." Doug stood next to me and looked around the room carefully. A curious expression appeared on his face. Then he continued, "Actually, I think Douglas's girlfriend has already left when I think about it. Earlier that evening, she watched him tag along with Heather for a few minutes, and then I saw that they had a pretty lively conversation. I haven't seen her since. He's a problem, Stan. The problem with a capital letter. He is married, and they are separated more often than together. He preys on married women or on those who have something he wants. He usually likes married and single women with money that he thinks he can get. I don't know why. He's worth millions on his own. You need to keep an eye on him." For the third time that evening, I went over to separate Heather and Jonathan. He looked at me the same way he had on most previous occasions when I separated him from Heather, and made a condescending remark when I left with her. Heather didn't thank me this time. She gave me a frustrated look and said, "Stan, what's the matter with you today?" You could see that I enjoyed talking to Jonathan. Why did you feel the need to separate us? He's not like most of the libertines you're saving me from. He's a really interesting guy, and he has some of the funniest stories. He is running for mayor and has been telling me about some of the people he meets and has to deal with during his campaign. When he found out that I work in the public information and advertising department of my company, he started asking me questions about how best to convey his message of the mayor to the voters. I think he could offer me a job, dear. I really need to communicate with him more. Just think about what would happen if I could get a position in his administration. I really don't care, Heather. I don't trust that asshole, and I don't like having him around you. Doug says he's nothing but trouble, and he's a real womanizer. I've also heard some really bad things about him, and I want you to be safe. From what I've heard, the position he's interviewing you for will require you to work hard. Heather glared at me for a moment. I saw the anger flash across her face, and I was afraid I'd ruined everything. But then she smiled. When she bent down to kiss me on the lips, she said, "Oh, it's cute. I really think you're jealous." "Well, you don't have to worry, honey. You're all mine." We had already parted again in the maelstrom of communicating people before I realized that she had said that I was all hers, and not that she was all mine. When this thought dawned on me, I stopped for a moment and wondered if it was just a slip of the tongue, or if she was trying to tell me something subconsciously. 3 months later, I had reason to remember that night in painful detail. My house has been restless for the last 2 months. Shortly after the party, Heather began to be late home from some of her meetings or visits to her parents. When I asked her about her lateness, she got angry, became defensive, saying that she either lost track of time or she needed to finish a project or something like that before she could leave. She also started volunteering for the local Republican Party after work, and it took up her time. Heather is the head of her department, and her skills in this field are almost legendary. She became a volunteer office manager at the local campaign headquarters and provided advice on public information initiatives. From what little I've heard, she eliminated the chaos and became a very popular volunteer. Like many other unsuspecting husbands who have been cuckolded, as she began to be away from our home more often, I began to notice that our lives were suffering. Now she let me use her where we had made love before, sometimes for hours on end. Oh, she always had a reason. For example, she was tired, or it was too late, or we didn't have time. But the fact remained. If before she had willingly, enthusiastically, passionately participated in our lovemaking, now she seemed to do it reluctantly, as if it were an unpleasant duty. I was talking to Doug one day about the recent problems in my marriage. He gave me a worried look. Finally, he said, "Stan, I'm starting to worry. Maybe I was the reason your marriage fell apart. I've been hearing for the last few weeks that Jonathan has found himself another married woman to play with. Rumor has it that he met her at a New Year's Eve party, and we both know where he was and who he spent most of his evening with on New Year's Eve. Presumably, she is also a volunteer in his campaign for mayor." I felt dizzy, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. Doug looked at me and continued talking. He said, "Stan, what's the matter? You suddenly turned as white as a sheet." I sat looking at Doug for a while, then said, "Heather started volunteering for the Republican Party in their office about an hour after work and on Saturdays. She always comes home late and refuses to talk more about what she does. It seems that whenever I bring it up, she gets defensive and angry. In the evenings, when she wakes up, she gets angry if I even approach her, and becomes almost violent if I try to see her naked or make love to her." Doug leaned back in his chair and pursed his lips for a moment, then said, "Stan, I'm going to find out what's going on with you, and let's just say that I intend to make him pay if he abused my hospitality by having an affair with my best friend's wife. I'd be pissed if he picked up some married woman at one of my parties, but abusing my hospitality by taking your wife away is even worse. I should have made him leave when his girlfriend did, but I was too worried about being a good host. If I am the cause of your problems, my friend, I promise to do everything in my power to fix it for you. I suppose I should tell you a little more about the arc here. He's my best friend. I would trust him with my life. I would trust him in a room with my naked wife, even if they hadn't made love for a whole year. He would never do anything to hurt me. We were closer than brothers. Doug is smart, and probably a lot smarter than anyone I've ever met. We were both in the same class in high school. He was giving a farewell speech, and I was trying my best to get into the top 10 of our graduating class of 223 people. He studied for 1 year in college and decided it was a waste of time. He had never had to study, and he missed almost all classes, but still scored 4 points. In the end, he just took a couple of courses in finance and then began to study on his own, everything he needed to know about investing and finance. Of course, the reason he needed to know about business and finance was that when he was in his freshman year of college, he inherited just over $70,000 when his grandparents died. Unlike most young people, when he received the money, he did not spend it. He actually bought a better used pickup truck and invested the rest in the stock market. The first 2 shares he purchased were on the recommendation of a broker. Of course, they were the highlight of the day, and the only ones making money were the broker and the brokerage house. This made Doug really angry, and he started learning. He watched CNBC, read, and researched. He decided to open a discount account with an online brokerage company. He transferred all his net worth to the account and started investing on his own. From the first deal that Doug made on his own, he started making money, much more than with the help of so-called experts. Of course, it didn't hurt that he started investing in the late 1980s during the tech boom. He went in and out of many high-paying stocks. No, he didn't make money from all his purchases, but he managed to increase his savings exponentially. Wise, and he was smart enough to help out when things started to go to hell. He moved his investments into safer, more common stocks and lifted the market with them. He bought the stock at just over $17,000 per share and sold it when the price reached $72,357 per share 3 years later. By that time, he was a multimillionaire and was doing business with other people, either in venture capital mode or with other investments, including real estate. I graduated from college and worked for 4 years as a salesman in a restaurant chain. I didn't like traveling, and I took Heather very seriously, so I became a stockbroker. I managed a small portion of Doug's millions. He gave me some of his investments to manage when I was just starting the business. I suspected that he did it to help a friend, and I felt guilty that he did it. I knew he didn't need me to advise and manage any part of his portfolio, and I felt it was a charity. He convinced me that I was needed. His arguments were twofold. First, he wanted some of his investments to be invested in various brokerage houses for security. Secondly, he felt that someone in the business might hear about good deals or bad information about some of his companies before he did. No, neither of us even thought for a moment about what could be considered insider trading. But still, from time to time, I found a pearl of wisdom that I could share with him. We both prospered. He sent many of his friends or acquaintances to me if they wanted to use full-service brokerage services. Then I made money by making deals for them. Doug didn't work outside the house. He worked 8 to 10 hours a day and very hard, but only for himself. He independently researched stocks, traded, and lived in a big way. He was trying to fully involve Heather and me in his social circle. We went with him to many charity events at his expense. Of course, from time to time I paid bills for some events because I, as a broker, also had an expense account. Doug and I went to political meetings and talked to influential people in our neighborhood. I think we attended all the parties that Doug hosted at his house. On Friday evening, after my conversation with Doug, we were supposed to go to a $500 political rally for a plate with Doug and his lady. He was treating Heather and me again. This time, for some reason, Heather was even more reluctant to come with us than usual. I'm afraid I insisted that she accompany me, and to this day, I regret that I did so. I suppose the train wreck our marriage was heading towards would have happened as soon as the Doug investigators who were watching Heather published their report. But at least I would have remained in the dark for a while longer. However, this dinner was the beginning of the end for us. When we arrived, I saw that we were at a reception where the incumbent state Senate candidate was supposed to speak in support of other state and local candidates. The money paid for the tickets went to the state Republican Party, although some of it would have gone to support local politicians. What I didn't realize was that the guest of honor was supposed to be a candidate for mayor of our beautiful city. Of course, it was none other than Jonathan Douglas. When we entered, I saw Jonathan standing at the front of the room, smiling and chatting with several dignitaries. I felt Heather pull away slightly and turn around to see what was bothering her. She stood staring at Jonathan. Her face shone like a woman in love. Then I suspected that I had lost my wife. I asked, "What?" I saw Heather shake slightly and then smile faintly at me. "I'm sorry, dear. I just didn't understand who this dinner was for." She looked so guilty that I wondered if it was true, but I didn't say anything. She should have known that Jonathan would be there since she worked part-time at the campaign headquarters. I thought that now I understand why she resisted so much when I insisted that we come. I looked at Doug and saw that he was watching our little conversation. He turned and stared at Jonathan before putting on a smile and placing his hand on the small of Heather's back. He led her to a chair and pulled it out, helping her to sit down. Then he sat Clarissa down in the chair that was supposed to be on his left. I was passing by him when he was doing it, and he said, "I'm sorry, Stan. I didn't know that he was one of the recipients of our generosity when he invited you. I saw her face, buddy. I hope I'm wrong, but I have an appointment on Monday with a friend I'd like you to meet. Can we have lunch? Say around 11:30? After finishing her meal, Heather excused herself and went to the bathroom. I noticed that when she got up from the table, Jonathan got up and left the room through another door. I thought for a moment, then started to get up and follow him. Doug put his hand on my shoulder and said, "No, Stan, it's been taken care of, and if it's her, it's too late anyway. Just wait until Monday. You are welcome." Later that evening, I lost sight of Heather again and went to look for her when I came back from the bathroom. I managed to get on stage and hide behind the curtain. I heard moans and soft, gentle voices. I immediately recognized one of them as Heather's voice. I felt a momentary surge of anger and headed towards the voices. I tripped over a rope and made some noise. I heard Heather whisper, "Oh, someone's coming." "I need to get out of here, honey. It won't do any of us any good if we get caught now. I'll see you at the office. I love you." I heard a quick slap, as if she had kissed someone quickly, then quick footsteps retreating to the other side of the stage. I followed them, but it was too late to notice as I assumed my cheating wife and Jonathan. I was slowly walking back the way I came when I bumped into Doug in the hallway. His face was like a thundercloud. He grabbed me and made me stop and look at him. He said, "Damn it, Stan, I told you to leave it at that. My people need to gather information for you before you do something stupid. If she's really cheating on you, and I believe she is, we need information, evidence, so that we can plan and carry out proper revenge on this asshole, and so that you can get the best possible divorce deal, if that's what you want. The way you're trying to do it, the only thing you're going to achieve is that you're going to be screwed by the legal system." After he calmed me down a bit, Doug continued, "I saw them rushing down the other corridor from here. They stopped at the door to the auditorium and she looked around trying to find you. When she didn't see you, she got scared and told him she thought it was you wandering around trying to find them. Now you have a suspicious traitor on your hands, and it will be more difficult to get the goods from her. When we got back to the table, we played it out. We made sure that Heather and some others saw us laughing and passing a pocket flask to each other. Heather glared at me when I took my place next to her and asked where we had been. Around this time, Clarissa came up to Doug and hugged him. She smiled at us and said, "Okay, you two. The next time I catch you sneaking to the car for a drink, I'll either go with you or turn you into the police. Now let me take a sip of this flask." We watched as Heather relaxed a little. Then she turned to Clarissa and asked, "Oh my God, is that what these two were doing?" I wondered where they were when I couldn't find them. Clarissa laughed and said, "Oh yes, I tried to get to them for my share before they went inside, but as you can see, they beat me to it." Later during the dance, it was my turn with Clarissa. She melted into me, and one day when I tried to turn around to look around the room behind me, she refused to follow my example. She kissed me gently on the cheek and said, "No, Stan, you really don't want to look there. Just dance with me and try to enjoy the evening. I know what you're going through right now, and trust me, it's only going to get worse. Just remember, Doug and I are here for you, and we will always be here for you." I relaxed a little and kissed her back gently. "Thanks for helping with the conversation earlier." I almost snapped, and Doug seems to think that would be very bad of me. I want to rip that asshole's head off so badly that I don't know what to do. The rest of the week and the weekend were hard for me. I was alternately scared and angry. Deep down, I knew that Heather had left me emotionally, and that it was only a matter of time before she left me physically. We haven't been a happy couple in weeks. I began to distance myself from her mentally, although I wasn't sure if she was cheating on me. If she wasn't cheating, we had some other problem, because we just weren't as loving a couple as we used to be. Finally, my meeting with Doug and his friend came. I was pretty sure his friend would be a private investigator. I was on edge and I could feel my stomach twisting. He was upset and had heartburn due to the acid. I could feel my anger boiling somewhere below the surface, and I knew the other two men could see it. I was scared of what I thought I might find out, and at the same time I was eager to find out. Doug stood up as I approached the table and shook my hand, then pulled me into a hug. After greeting me, he introduced me to his friend Simon Hobbs, who really turned out to be an investigator. We sat down and studied the menu for a minute to order our dishes. The waitress jumped up and took our order. Then Doug said, "Okay, why don't we get this unpleasant business over with first?" He looked at his other guest, then back at me. The private investigator reached into his briefcase and pulled out a large envelope. He handed it to me and said, We've been following your wife and Mr. Douglas according to Mr. Beaver's instructions. The surveillance continued for 20 days from the moment we were hired until last Saturday evening. During this period, as we found out, the subjects had lunch together every day, except on Sundays, when she always seemed to stay at home. Their meals were scattered around the city but always took place in better hotels, after which they went to a room rented by Mr. Douglas's campaign. On 8 different occasions, we managed to get into the room by posing as a room service waiter. In all 8 cases, none of the subjects were dressed, and the bed was used. Photos of the room and the subjects are shown in the report. We also made audio recordings of each meeting by placing a microphone under the door of the room. The subjects made love every time they visited the hotels during our observation. For many days, we recorded inappropriate contacts at the campaign headquarters or after it. In fact, we have photos showing the subjects performing sexual acts 3 times at the campaign headquarters, and once when they attended a party at a local strip bar with some friends and supporters of Mr. Douglas. Perhaps the best, or at least the most disgusting thing we've recorded is when Mr. Douglas used your wife to gain the support of the Municipal Employees Union. They met with Union President Stephen Negrano at the Gentlemen's Club. He seemed very taken with your wife. We have photos of her sitting on his lap and his hand is under her dress. My operative managed to get close enough to record the conversation. Listen to this fragment of the recording, then we will continue. Simon put a small laptop on the table and started playing a fragment from the DVD. He said, "You will be provided with a copy of this DVD in your report, but I wanted to discuss this incident with you before we interrupt our meeting. My operative was very excited about this information, and I believe your lawyer will be thrilled too." Doug and I leaned forward and watched and listened to the following fragment. During the session, Heather sat between Jonathan and Stephen. The 2 men bent over her to talk, and Jonathan's hands wandered. He caressed Heather and held his hand under her skirt for a few moments while the fragment unfolded. Once we heard Heather telling him to stop, but he told her, "Now, Heather, you know how much you like what we're doing. Just relax and go with the flow. It's not like things like this don't happen at this club from time to time." When he stopped talking, Jonathan leaned over to Heather and kissed her gently. She clung to him while his hand continued to work under her skirt, one of the shortest skirts I've ever seen her wear. I must add, I've never seen one like this before. As Jonathan leaned back in his seat, Stefan reached out and pulled her to him. She started to get up and resist, but he continued to pull her until she was on his lap. His big hand slipped under her dress. Heather hissed, "Stop it, Stefan." Stephen looked at Jonathan and said, "Jonathan, I think you know what you need to do to get the union's approval. I want to spend the weekend with this lady. If I get this, I'll make sure the union supports your candidacy." Heather tensed and tried to get up, hissing, "No, this will never happen. Now let me go." Stephen just looked at Jonathan and raised his eyebrows while he held Heather on his lap and continued to play with her. Jonathan swallowed and leaned over to Heather. He said, "Honey, we really need this support. Please just go with him and help me with this. I mean, it's going to help secure our future and, well, that doesn't mean you've never made love before. Just tell your husband you have a meeting this weekend." In the video, Heather looked shocked and resisted for another moment. Then we saw her relax and they kissed. By this time, many of the men in the club were looking at Heather rather than the strippers. Around this time, the club's manager came up to the table. He looked at Heather, then at the men on either side of her. He seemed nervous and stuttered as he said, "Please, Mr. Negrano, I've ignored a lot for you, but I've been informed that you and the boys are becoming too obvious. Lieutenant Jones told me that the chief asked some of his detectives to come to the club and try to reduce the number of demonstrations that you and the lady just had. If they catch us letting things like this happen, they'll shut me down. Could you please take this to one of the back rooms or to the hotel? Please, sir. This business is all I do for a living." Stephen laughed and looked at one of the big men on the other side of the table. He said, "Hi, Ralph. Why don't you give Joe a couple $1,000 for his trouble? The little lady and I are going to the DoubleTree for the weekend. Prepare everything for me, okay? Make it look like a meeting of union leaders as we usually do." I felt that I was getting more and more upset, and I started to get up. I growled, "That lying thing. She wasn't there last weekend. She called me on Friday evening and informed me that she had been assigned an accident recovery project for her employer and was flying to San Francisco." Doug and Simon grabbed me and sat me back down in my seat. Simon said, "Please wait, sir. I want to fast forward and show you another video and then we'll just let you read the report yourself." We have some ideas about this that I wanted to talk to you about, but I thought you might want to watch the DVD before we talk about them. Now my operative has stopped filming at the club and called for backup. My operatives managed to get ahead of Stanley at the DoubleTree. After his thugs checked him in, he and Heather went to the bar for a couple of drinks. My operatives followed the thugs in the hotel uniforms we had purchased to the room. When they opened the door, my men followed them. After the thugs finished inspecting the room, my men began to adjust pillows, flowers, and other decorations. Simon smiled and continued. The senior manager even sent his assistant downstairs to get fresh flowers and more champagne, so that they would have an excuse to wander around the room longer. We managed to place several cameras and microphones in the main room and 2 bedrooms. By the time your wife and Stanley returned to the room, they were both drunk. The cameras captured these shots among others. Simon started playing DVDs on his small computer again. Heather and Stanley entered the room and closed the door. Stanley bent down and kissed her, then literally tore her blouse with a roar. The buttons came off and flew in all directions. He pulled it off her shoulders while Heather lowered her skirt. After her skirt fell into a pile at her feet, she shrugged and let what was left of her blouse fall next to her. I already knew from the photos taken at the club that she was not wearing underwear. She stepped in and kicked off her shoes, then took Stephen's hand and, giggling, pulled him into the largest bedroom to a king-sized bed. Heather undressed Stephen and pushed him back onto the bed. After a few minutes, we saw another male figure enter the frame. Stephen looked at him and smiled. The second man we could see now was the director of city services. I do not know which of the men was the largest. The director of city services was now standing right behind Heather. I thought this was the end and started to lean back, but Simon said, "Wait a little longer." After that, Simon turned off his computer. He looked at me for a moment and said, "Your wife stayed in this hotel room until check, out time on Monday. During this time, she slept with all the senior managers of the Municipal Employees Union, as well as with Stephen. We've heard about plans to use union money and paid union workers to support Jonathan's nomination for mayor." Late Saturday night, Jonathan visited the room. He, the director, and Stephen made love to Heather for most of the night. We also have photos of it and recordings where they plan to misuse city funds if Jonathan is elected. We also have photos of Senator Nussbaum and 2 judges making love to your wife and Jonathan Douglas. Records show that he also traded her services for their approval. The investigator looked at me before continuing. He said, "During your attempt to catch your wife and Mr. Douglas at a campaign dinner, they were going to make love on stage. He had just started the performance when she heard you and made him stop. That's when they ran away from you. We have photos of what happened there. It would be better if you didn't interfere. Photos of this action in that place would be very destructive. We were going to take pictures so that the crowd could be seen in the background. At least you weren't caught and you didn't make a scene that would further undermine your efforts to end things on a successful note for you. We have provided you with a copy of the entire dossier, sir, and will provide it to your lawyer if you so wish. Our investigation fees cover any local witness testimony in court if necessary. However, I would recommend that we continue monitoring for possible criminal prosecution. I know that the police are usually responsible for this, but if we provide them and the FBI with some documents about the misuse of campaign funds and conspiracy, they will take our accusations more seriously. Also, if you file for divorce and your wife ends up in jail, you'll get a better settlement." Even knowing this was going to happen, I have to admit that I was upset and shocked. I couldn't believe the depth of depravity and disrespect that my wife showed during the period when she was under surveillance. The document showed that she felt she was in love with Jonathan. They were actively discussing how and when she would leave me. She was ranting about the position promised to her in Jonathan's administration if he was elected mayor. Perhaps what shocked me the most was her willingness to spend the weekend at the DoubleTree and the actions she performed there for her lover and his friends. Some of the things Heather did with Jonathan were things she categorically refused to do with or for me. I always knew that Heather was striving to succeed in her career and admired influential people, but I just couldn't believe everything she was willing to do to move on. I felt almost physically ill. I didn't eat much, and I noticed Doug didn't either. After the investigator left, we had a few drinks. We were both silent for a while, lost in our own thoughts, before Doug said to me, "Stan, I'm so sorry that I ruined your marriage. I consider myself completely to blame for your troubles and intend to make amends to you. I know I can't fix what I let happen, but I intend to make it as right for you as I can. I'll find you a good lawyer for the divorce. I will provide you with any other support you need until you are as close to what you used to be as possible." I pushed back from the table and looked at Doug. I said, "Well, start looking for that lawyer." I was almost ready to give her an ultimatum. Either she stops acting like this or we get divorced before I know for sure about her cheating. There's no way I'm leaving this fool now. Oh my God, I can't believe she did all this. I wonder when she changed, or did I just never know what kind of woman she really was? As for the other, you know as well as I do that it wasn't your fault that Heather cheated, and because of that, you don't owe me anything. On Thursday, Doug called me and said, "Hi, my friend. I found you a real shark as a lawyer. She passionately hates traitors and always takes the side of the innocent in the divorce process. She really hates public figures and businessmen who use their status and official position to influence women. If you act correctly, you can not only dump Heather and keep most of your assets, but also get your piece of meat from Jonathan." Doug gave me the name and phone number of the lawyer he recommended. I called her later that day to make an appointment for a consultation. When I told her assistant who I was, she said they were expecting my call. She also said that they had penciled in a meeting for the next morning at 9 in the morning if I could come. I agreed to the time of the meeting and received a list of things that I needed to take with me, information that I should have with me for the first meeting. When I arrived the next morning, I was immediately shown into the office. I was impressed with my new lawyer, and we quickly moved on to a friendly discussion of my wishes regarding the upcoming divorce proceedings. I told my new lawyer, Sally, I want to end this marriage with all the property. I know I probably won't get it, but that's what I want. I want to sue him for stealing wives, for everything we can. I want to deprive him of the opportunity to participate in the mayoral elections and leave him penniless. Sally smiled and leaned back in her chair. She rocked him slightly from side to side, thinking. Finally, she smiled and asked, "Do you really want to do this, or do you want to rape him financially? Will it cost him the election and his good name and send him to prison? We can almost certainly get him some jail time if we do everything right. I've already looked at the fragments of the detective's report, and it's good. I'm sorry, I know how bad this is for you and your marriage, but the information contained in it is so terrible that we can crucify most of the main participants in this little mess. In fact, I am obliged to hand over the investigator's report to the authorities because they violated several federal laws. If you let me do this first and then file for divorce, we can deal him a more painful blow with retribution. If you apply first, he may be able to escape and avoid capture for a while. I don't care what we do to him and those other jerks who made love to Heather. So far it hurts, and very much. I know Heather is responsible for all this mess, but she couldn't have done this to him if he hadn't wanted to. From what I saw when he first met her, I assume he was the aggressor. He pursued her until she succumbed to his charms and climbed into his bed. You know, it takes two to tango. She always wore rings so that he would know she was married. In fact, I heard them talking on the tapes about her dumb husband and planning how to treat me when it was time for a big breakup. Sally and I worked through her questions, and I made a decision. I told her to prepare and file the divorce papers immediately. Sally and I also agreed that the private investigator's report should be immediately turned over to the FBI so that they can begin investigating violations of the campaign law and misuse of union and city funds and offices. Sally suggested that I contact the processing server to have Heather serviced and threaten to file lawsuits against Mr. Douglas. She said, "If he works like most politicians and influential people, he will either threaten you with physical violence, threaten to fire you from your job, or threaten you with a counterclaim. If you persist, I expect that he will offer to negotiate with you secretly and bribe you. If this is the case, then depending on where he gets the money, we can hold him accountable for even more violations of the election campaign law. No matter how slippery many people in government positions are, I expect that he will try to divert funds to the election campaign in order to bribe you." Sally reached into her drawer and gave me a very small microphone and a voice recorder. She said, "I want you to always have this with you and for it to work. Wear a microphone hidden in your hair and hide the recorder in the car. The range of the transmitter is about 1 kilometer. If your car is out of range of the transmitter, this small microphone is capable of recording up to 6 hours of conversation inside the device. The device will download all the recordings stored inside as soon as you are within reach of your car. If you will give me your keys, I will ask someone to install a video recorder in your car while we finish here. I also suggest that you either re-hire a private investigator or let me hire one for you to continue monitoring your wife and Mr. Douglas. I've heard rumors that Mrs. Malone is not the first wife he seduced, and when he was caught, he tried illegal means to solve the problem. If we have a plan and suggestions on tape, this time we can really hurt him and your wife." I smiled and said, "The private investigator gave the same recommendation. I'm still keeping him on deposit." The next Thursday morning, Sally called me and said, "Mr. Malone, we're ready to file for divorce and serve your wife. Do you still want to follow our plan to be present at her service and give your comments?" "Oh yes, at least I can have a little fun being there. I was also thinking about the service. Don't you think it would be nice to serve her this Friday evening at the campaign headquarters?" Sally was silent for a moment, then said, "No, Stan, I'm afraid I think that would be a very bad idea. If you serve her there and make the comments you plan to make, all the campaign staff in the office will either hear you or know about your threats almost immediately. If this happens, it will be in all the newspapers tomorrow, and the kind and noble Mr. Douglas will be cornered. He may lose the election, but he will have no incentive to threaten you or try to bribe you. I suggest postponing the service until she is either alone or with him alone." "Okay, I think I understand your point of view. Why don't we just follow them and see if they go out alone tomorrow night? Heather usually doesn't come home until almost midnight on Fridays. I think the private investigator's report said that they usually spent some time alone in a hotel room on a Friday night, usually in the same one they used on Friday at noon. Could we just serve them in the room and maybe catch them red-handed?" Sally agreed to hire a processing server and interrupt their date in a hotel room on Friday evening. When I entered my office, 2 men in suits were waiting for me. They introduced themselves and said they wanted to discuss how I was managing some funds for their widowed mother. I smiled and invited them into my office. After I closed the door, they came up to me and showed me their identification cards. They were from the FBI and wanted to discuss my interest in Jonathan. They were working on the case based on the materials that my lawyer had already forwarded. When these 2 gentlemen found out that I was going to use the processing server and record the procedure on tape, they also asked me to put on one of their devices to record the conversation. This request bothered me because I was wondering how it would affect my plans to make some questionable money on Jonathan, my winnings, if you will. I couldn't think of a good reason to refuse them, so I agreed to wear their wire too. That evening, we all followed 2 forgetful lovebirds from the campaign headquarters to the hotel. They left the headquarters at 7 in the evening and were in the room by 7:30. There were so many of us that it looked like a column. I was actually afraid that we would be recognized. After they got to the hotel, we gave them almost an hour. I had the foresight to bring a camera with me to see if I could record this period of time for posterity. I'm not usually interested in home movies, but in this case I made an exception. We were just about to knock on the door when we received a gift from God. We heard the elevator door open and the room service waiter came out pushing a cart loaded with dishes. He came up to the room and looked at us questioningly. I smiled and pointed to the door, then said, "Come on in, be our guest." We had no idea we were interrupting Mr. Douglas's dinner. "We'll just be back in a minute." The waiter smiled and said, "Okay, no problem." He knocked on the door and when the jerk asked who it was, he said, "Room service." The door opened and our friendly waiter entered the room. The process server and I stood out of sight and waited for the waiter to leave. When he opened the door to leave, I moved closer so that it wouldn't close. Then the process server and I quietly entered the room. We stood in the doorway for a while, out of sight of the 2 traitors. We waited for Jonathan and Heather to start dinner before fully entering the room and noticing them. I was a little ahead when we entered the room. I was shocked and heartbroken by what I saw. I know I shouldn't have done it since I saw the detective's report, but I was. There's something special about watching a recording of something and seeing it in real life. Heather and Jonathan were naked. They were sitting at a table with food spread out in front of them. They ordered some snacks and some dessert, as well as a bottle of wine. Heather was sitting on Jonathan's lap with her back to him. Judging by the expressions on their faces, they were over the moon with happiness. From time to time, Heather turned her head over her shoulder and kissed Jonathan tenderly. I started filming when we turned the corner. Finally, I nodded to the process server and he entered the room. He asked, "Are you Jonathan Douglas and Heather Malone?" Heather screamed and jumped off Jonathan's lap. She rushed to the bed and wrapped herself in the hotel robe that was lying on top of her. Jonathan cursed and stood up angrily. He growled, "Yes, asshole, it is, and I advise you to get the hell out of my room right now." "How did you even get here?" Well, sir, your room service waiter let us in when he left. Didn't you hear us ask if we could come in? I was sure you invited us in. The process server went further into the room and handed Heather the divorce papers. He said, "You've been served." I walked further into the room and Heather finally saw me. She said, "Stan, what are you doing here and what kind of divorce talk is this? You'll have nothing left, but I'll have everything." No, Heather, you're not going to do any of this. In fact, if you know what's best for you, you'll just sign the papers and accept the agreement I've proposed. When I'm done with you, I'm going to get my piece of meat from this lover. I am in the process of filing a lawsuit against him and his campaign for mental cruelty and alienation of affection. Of course, I am lucky that we live in one of the states where such lawsuits are still allowed. Of course, this could affect the election as a bonus. Roughly speaking, you've been screwed up, and now you're going to get royally. Heather didn't even try to come home that night. In fact, I didn't see or hear from her until the following Wednesday, when she called me at work. She didn't even try to apologize or make small talk. When I answered the phone, she started talking. She said, "Jonathan and I want to meet with you about this mess. We have booked a conference room at the hotel for this evening. We want to end this mess so we can move on. We'll be waiting for you at 7. I didn't get any attention. I was not asked if I could come to the meeting. I was just ordered to be present. I called Sally and told her about the phone call. Then I called my FBI contact. Sally told me to be sure to attend, as did the FBI. Sally said she would be there with me. The FBI also said they would have people nearby to help in case things went badly. When I arrived at the hotel, I asked where my meeting was taking place. The receptionist led me down a corridor to the smallest of the meeting rooms. When I arrived, a very large man was standing guard at the door. I started to enter, but he stopped me. "There's a private meeting in this room, sir." "Yes, I know. I'm Stan Malone, and I have to be there." After the bully checked my ID, he knocked on the door. It opened slightly, and he said, "Mr. Malone is here, sir." I didn't hear what was said, but the door closed. The bully turned to me and said, "I have to search you, sir. Could you please empty the contents of the pockets into this tray?" After I emptied my pockets, I was searched. I began to get angry and demanded to explain why I was being searched. The bully grinned and said, "Well, sir, it's known that people try to kill political figures, and Mr. Douglas doesn't want to take any chances. I strongly suspected that I was being searched for a dictaphone or wiretapping, but I did not ask. I had pretty long hair, and the little transmitters I carried with me were hidden in them, glued to my head. After the search, it took almost 5 minutes before the door opened and I was allowed to enter the meeting room. When I entered the room, I saw Heather sitting at the table and looking at me. She looked very guilty, and her face and chest were very flushed. I felt a surge of anger just realizing what she was probably doing. I looked at Jonathan and almost lost control of myself. His eyes were sparkling and he was grinning. I knew he was gloating about the fact that he had just used my wife. He was watching her, and I knew he could tell that I had seen evidence of her recent activity. The meeting went exactly as Sally and I expected. Jonathan threatened me first with dismissal from my job, then with bodily harm if I did not offer Heather a better deal, and abandoned my stated plans to file lawsuits against him and his campaign. I leaned back in my chair and said, "Listen to me, mister. I know that you and your friends may be able to get to me and maybe hurt or kill me, but that won't save you. I have taken precautions and prepared several packages to be sent if anything happens to me or my family. Even if I get injured in an accident, these packages will be mailed. You know as well as I do that you cannot control all the media in this country. Some of them will be published, especially if I am seriously injured or die. You're going to sink." I watched as anger flooded Jonathan's face and saw the tension that I realized years ago meant that Heather was furious. I smiled at them and continued to say, "I know what you were doing just before I came in here, and I have photos of you doing it a few more times. Heck, I even have photos and recordings of your meeting last week at the hotel with the union and senior members of the city administration. Do you really think all these gentlemen will thank you for dragging them along? I can assure you that if something happens to me, the documents that will be mailed will contain information about them and my wife, as well as about you. Do we both know that many of them communicate, shall we say, with dangerous people, whom it is dangerous to cross paths with?" Heather glared at me, and it seemed to me that Jonathan looked a little sick. He tried to be indignant and said, "You heard what I said. Stop your threats and do it quietly. Otherwise, now get your ass out of here. I've said my word." I smiled and stood up. I looked Jonathan in the eye until he started to look worried. I could tell that it was all he could do to keep looking back at me. I laughed and turned to head for the door. When I opened the door, I stopped once more and said, "You know, Jonathan, I might change my mind if I was sure of a very fair settlement from my wife in the divorce." I went straight home, and when I got there, I found my friend the private investigator waiting for me. He and an FBI agent were visiting. They both took off their microphones and secured them. My private investigator said, "We got all this and the conversation that Jonathan had with your wife and his friends after you left. He has set up surveillance on you with orders to keep an eye on you and inform him if they can find anything harmful in you at all. You've made him very, very worried." I waited 3 days and then made sure that my tale from Jonathan was next to me when I called my lawyer. First, we discussed the divorce. Then, when I was finishing the conversation, I said, "Sally, I'm tired of waiting for this jerk. I've told him and Heather what it's worth for me to leave, and so far they're both blocking me. Prepare the documents and file a lawsuit against Jonathan. I think we need to name a higher figure. Let's ask for $10 million. This should get his attention and spread all over the news." I laughed to myself when I saw the bully who was following me step back and grab his cell phone. I watched him talking and gesticulating excitedly. I got in my car and drove straight home. I hadn't even had dinner that night when Jonathan called me. He never admitted that his man heard me tell Sally to sue. He said, "Listen, asshole, Heather and I discussed our meeting and decided to give you some of what you asked for. She'll sign the divorce papers you gave her unchanged. She will leave your marriage with only her personal property and quit her job. I've decided to enter into an out-of-court voluntary settlement agreement with you if you assure me that none of this will come out." Well, asshole, all I can do in this regard is promise you that I won't be the one to miss the situation. Naturally, I can't promise that no one will let the cat out of the bag. I mean, there are probably hundreds of people who know right now that you made love to my wife. Okay, here's the thing. You sign a non-disclosure agreement, and I transfer $1 million to your account without question. Heather is handing over the divorce papers signed in agreement with the agreement you proposed. I laughed and said, "Damn it, it's a small thing. I have just instructed my lawyer to file a claim for damages in the amount of $10 million. I know I probably won't get it, but you need to do a lot more than $1 million before I drop the lawsuit. I can make over $1 million on the rights to books and films if I sell this story." All right. I think I can offer a little more, but not much. How about $1.7 million? I think I can do without unnecessary words. I'll come up with some way to show that they were spent on the campaign. But this is my main suggestion. Okay, but we need to move on. I won't tell my lawyer to stop her work until I see the money in my bank account. Here are the numbers of the secret account in the Cayman Islands. I didn't tell him that I opened an account in his name and used his mailing address. I was hoping that federal investigators would find this and trace the transfer of money from his campaign to the bank. Of course, I planned to transfer the money on the day it was received so that it could not be returned. Later that evening, I heard the doorbell ring. When I got there, I saw the same man who was guarding the door during my meeting with Jonathan and Heather. He looked at me and handed me a tablet with a legal document on one page. He said, "Mr. Douglas told me to bring this to you for signature." I read the document, then looked at it. I said, "I think everything is fine, but before I sign, I need to discuss this with my lawyer." Well, I shouldn't leave without it. I sighed and closed the door in his face. I went to my office and called Sally. When I explained the problem, she agreed to come to my house and review the document. It took her almost an hour to get there, but after she read the document, she smiled and told me to sign it. 3 days later, I discovered that the account balance in the Cayman Islands is $1,700,000. That same day, my lawyer called me and said that Heather had returned the signed divorce agreement and it had been filed with the court. Since the divorce was indisputable, it was supposed to be final in 30 days. I've already transferred the money from the Cayman account in case this asshole tries to get it back. I transferred them all over the world twice, then transferred them to another account in another Cayman Islands bank under another assumed name. I continued to work during these difficult times, but my production suffered. My commissions were almost half as much as usual, and not only because of the bad economy. Many times, one of my colleagues covered for me, and they received commissions from sales and purchases made by my clients. After the final divorce, I still couldn't collect my thoughts. I made more mistakes at work, and it cost me dearly. If I bought or sold something wrong for a customer, I had to fulfill the terms of the deal. I'm tired of constantly looking over my shoulder to make sure nothing has happened to me. I was afraid that at some point Jonathan and his friends would decide to take a chance and hurt me for what I had done to him. I was especially worried about revenge when the feds finally came out against all the players. One evening, I was sitting at home wondering how my life could turn into hell so quickly when the doorbell rang. It was after 9 o'clock in the evening. When I opened the door, I saw Heather standing there. She was crying and there was a big red spot on her face. I could tell she's going to have a hell of a bruise by morning. She looked at me, then her gaze dropped to the floor. She said, "Stan, please, can I talk to you?" I almost said no to her and slammed the door in her face, but then I decided to see what could make her come to me to talk. I stepped back and motioned her inside. I didn't say a word. I just took her back to the office and sat her down in my chair. I still had the surveillance cameras working, and I wanted to talk where the image would be better. I made sure to direct her to the couch so that the cameras could take the best picture. Heather sat and looked at me, crying silently. Finally, she said, "Stan, I know it's too late, but I'm finally here." Heather took a deep breath and continued, "I want to apologize to you for what I did to us. I knew better, but somehow that bastard broke through my defenses. You know how much I love to flirt and how much I want to succeed. Somehow he knew exactly which of my buttons to press, and I fell madly in love with him. It was like he was completely in tune with me, and I just couldn't say no to him. I was so excited about the promising job he promised me after the election if I helped him that I lost sight of us." Heather was crying loudly now. She looked at me and said, "Do you know how angry I was at you on New Year's Eve when you tried to break us up? Oh, Stan, you were already late the last time you pulled me away from Jonathan. We've just returned to the room from one of Doug's bedrooms. That bastard talked me into making love to him a little less than 3 hours after I met him. I'm so sorry. It only took 3 weeks of running around behind your back before I was convinced that I needed to be completely in his camp. He promised to divorce his wife and marry me after the election. He told me that he couldn't file for divorce in advance because it might cost him the election. I fell in love with the idea of being married to the mayor, and maybe later to a senator or governor. After the trouble you caused, I started to feel that Jonathan was moving away from me. Tonight at the office, I caught him in a warehouse with one of the young female students who work as volunteers. You were right, as always, Stan. He was filling her head with the same shit he was filling mine with. He promised to leave his wife and marry her as soon as the elections were over. I stood up to them and he laughed at me. He asked me what made me think that he would someday marry an old slut like me, especially one who had cheated on her husband in the past. He told me that if I treated him well, he would keep me with him, and I could live a good life as his social secretary. He laughed at me and said that I could entertain some of his most important participants, as I had done in the past. His new girlfriend laughed at me and I slapped him. Then he hit me. Stan, I know it's too late for us, but I wanted you to know that I finally figured it out, and I wanted to apologize for what I did to us, to you, really. Stan, if you could find the strength to forgive me, I would really like us to be together again. I knew I had a good man, but there was something about Jonathan that I couldn't resist. I got so excited when I thought about maybe living a big life with him that I lost all common sense. Heather stared at me for a moment longer. I watched as silent tears flowed down her cheeks. Finally, she smiled at me uncertainly, got up and walked over to my chair. Heather leaned forward and kissed me gently on the cheek, then ran out of the room and out of the house. I sat in shock for a moment before reaching the door just in time to see her car drive away. I sighed and thought how I wish she would come to her senses before spreading her legs for this asshole and his supporters from the union and the government. I turned around and went back to the office. A few days later, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to get away from all the memories and pain. I put my house up for sale and hired a real estate agent to find me another one with no memories. I hired a team to come and pack my furniture for storage. I hired another team to clean the house and another to take care of the yard. I called Doug or Sally back from time to time. They said the feds retained control of the investigation in case the police were also corrupt. There was an agreement not to mention my name in the investigation and not to use the information passed on to Sally unless absolutely necessary. Sally told me that the feds had found enough evidence of corruption to make them willing to honor this agreement. Almost 6 weeks after I decided to sell my house, I woke up to the fact that a special edition was being shown on all national news programs. The feds arrested everyone involved in Jonathan's use of Heather. They were charged with several counts, including but not limited to misuse of funds, corruption, abuse of office, violations during the election campaign, and racketeering. Jonathan was arrested for misuse of campaign funds, improperly accepting donations beyond what is legally permitted, and selling the rights to appointed positions in his prospective future administration. Unfortunately, and maybe fortunately, Heather was also arrested for some violations. I called Sally as soon as her office opened that morning to see if she could shed any light on the subject. All she knew at that point was that there had been leaks from other people besides me, so it seemed that everything would be clear to me with Jonathan and his payment. Of course, he couldn't get it back, but if he had sued me over a non-disclosure agreement, it was possible, even likely, that I would have won, because the FBI and news services attributed tips to 2 campaign employees who initiated the investigation. I just hope I'm not suspected of snitching on union members. I didn't need a visit from unsavory people in the middle of the night. I smiled to myself, thinking how hard I had worked to secretly slip incriminating notes and documents into the piles of papers that some workers were processing. I've done this many times when I was supposedly in the office looking for Heather. When I finished talking to Sally, I leaned back in my chair and smiled. I took revenge on Jonathan and got rid of my cheating wife at no cost other than the lawyer's fee. I also became richer by $1.7 million thanks to Jonathan's generosity. Now I was free and could find a decent woman to marry and start a family with.